When the war in Europe began to turn against Germany, thousands of soldiers surrendered on distant battlefields, from the sands of North Africa to the hedgerows of France. They were tired, hungry, and broken, but none of them could have imagined what awaited them across the ocean in the land of their enemy, the United States of America. As Allied ships carried German prisoners of war across the Atlantic, many expected harsh treatment, cold barracks, and meager food. They had heard stories, propaganda tales, of brutal camps and merciless guards. But the reality that met them on American soil was something they could hardly believe. The first German POWs stepped off trains and trucks onto sprawling camps spread across America, from Texas to Pennsylvania, from Louisiana to Wisconsin. And the shock came not from cruelty, but from comfort. Instead of chains or cages, they saw neat wooden barracks, clean bedding, and organized dining halls. They were fed regularly, 3 meals a day. And the meals looked suspiciously like something out of a U.S. Army kitchen. Steak, bread, vegetables, even dessert. And then came the moment that none of them would ever forget. An American guard, smiling faintly, pushed a cart through the mess hall. On it were tubs of ice cream, vanilla, chocolate, strawberry. The German prisoners stared, unsure if this was some sort of trick. Ice cream, in a prisoner camp, during a world war. Some of the younger soldiers laughed nervously. Others hesitated before accepting a scoop. The cold sweetness melted in their mouths. A taste of luxury they hadn't known since before the war began. For many, it was the first ice cream they had eaten in years. To them, it wasn't just food, it was something else. A symbol of how differently America fought this war. While cities in Europe burned, the United States could still afford to make ice cream for its prisoners. In the weeks that followed, the surprises kept coming. German POWs were given soap, cigarettes, and access to medical care. They could write letters home, receive mail, and even listen to radio broadcasts approved by camp officials. For men who expected punishment, they found something closer to decency. But among the most unbelievable things in those camps was another American icon, Coca-Cola. In some camps, particularly those near large cities or U.S. Army supply routes, Coca-Cola bottles appeared in the canteens. To German soldiers raised on bitter coffee and wartime rations, it was a strange, fizzy miracle. They watched the bubbles rise in the glass bottles, sipped the sweet drink, and exchanged looks of disbelief. One prisoner later wrote in his diary, "We came as enemies, yet they give us Coca-Cola." It wasn't generosity alone. The U.S. military saw value in treating prisoners humanely. By following the Geneva Convention, they showed moral strength and in return hoped their own captured soldiers in Europe might receive better treatment. Still, for many Germans, the experience was life-changing. They arrived filled with hate, fear, and Nazi propaganda, and found themselves living in a society that seemed free, efficient, and strangely kind. Inside the camps, there were libraries, schools, even orchestras. POWs could attend English lessons, read American newspapers, and watch films screened by the army. For the first time, many of them saw the world beyond Hitler's Germany, and what they saw began to change them. At first, suspicion ruled everything. Prisoners whispered that it was psychological warfare, a trick to make them soft, but as months passed, suspicion turned to curiosity, then to admiration. They watched American guards talk freely, criticizing their officers, joking about politics, and reading newspapers filled with both praise and protest. To a soldier raised under totalitarian control, this freedom of speech was astonishing. They started asking questions. How can you speak like that about your own leaders? Why don't you fear punishment? And the American guards would shrug. This is America, they'd say. By late 1944, over 400,000 German prisoners were living in the United States. Some worked on farms, harvesting crops or building roads. They were paid small wages, which they could spend in camp canteens, often on cigarettes, candy, or, yes, Coca-Cola. The irony wasn't lost on them. In Europe, their families were starving. Here, as prisoners, they were drinking Coke and eating ice cream. One American newspaper called it the most comfortable captivity in history. But for the prisoners themselves, it was more complicated. Comfort brought guilt. They began to question everything they had believed about the enemy and about themselves. Letters smuggled back to Germany told the story. They treat us like humans. America is not what we were told. If we lose this war, maybe it is not the worst thing. For American officials, these words were more powerful than propaganda. They showed that decency could win hearts, even of the enemy. And yet, not everything was perfect. In some camps, tensions ran high between hardcore Nazis and those who were ready to accept defeat. Secret cells formed, punishments were dealt out, and the U.S. Army had to keep constant watch. Even paradise, it seemed, could not erase ideology overnight. Still, for every act of defiance, there were dozens of quiet transformations. Men who had once sworn loyalty to the Third Reich now found themselves humming American tunes, writing English phrases, or sketching images of Coca-Cola bottles in their diaries. As the months passed, life inside the American POW camps took on a rhythm. There were routines, duties, and moments of calm that many prisoners had not felt in years. The war, for them, was distant, just a memory carried on the wind. In some camps, German soldiers began organizing theater plays, art exhibitions, and sports competitions. They built small gardens, crafted model ships, and even carved wooden toys. To many Americans, it was remarkable. The enemy they had fought so fiercely was now part of everyday life. The Red Cross often inspected these camps, ensuring that the Geneva Convention was followed. Reports confirmed what many German families could scarcely believe. Their sons and brothers were being treated fairly, even kindly. It was a form of psychological victory for the United States, one won not through bullets, but through humanity. The contrast was especially striking when prisoners received letters from home. In those letters came news of destruction, cities bombed, families displaced, food shortages everywhere. For many prisoners of war, guilt began to mix with gratitude. How could they live well here while their homeland suffered? Yet at night, when the canteen opened and the sound of bottles clinking filled the air, the feeling of guilt softened. A cold Coca-Cola in hand, the taste of a strange new world. To some, it was just a drink. To others, it became a symbol, a reminder that the world outside Germany was not as dark as they had been told. In one camp in Texas, a former Luftwaffe pilot later recalled, "We worked on American farms. The farmers treated us like workers, not enemies. On Sundays, they gave us Coca-Cola and ice cream. It was the first time I thought, maybe everything we believed was wrong." These quiet moments did something no army could achieve. They opened hearts. The war may have created enemies, but kindness created understanding. When the war finally ended in 1945, the news reached the camps in a strange silence. No cheers, no celebrations, just a long pause as thousands of men realized the world they had fought for was gone. Hitler was dead, Germany lay in ruins, and they, once soldiers of the Reich, were still standing in America, safe, fed, and alive. Some prisoners wept, others simply stared at the horizon, unsure what the future would bring. They would soon be sent home, but home no longer existed as they remembered it. Before their departure, many POWs were shown films about democracy, human rights, and post-war reconstruction. Some laughed, others listened, but the message sank in deeper than anyone expected. By the time repatriation began, thousands of these men had changed profoundly. They carried back with them more than memories. They carried the image of a nation that treated even its enemies with dignity. That memory, they would say later, was the first seed of a new Germany. In post-war years, historians traced how these experiences influenced the rebuilding of West Germany. Many former POWs became teachers, engineers, even politicians. They spoke of America not as a conqueror, but as a teacher. And yes, some spoke fondly of the strange taste of ice cream and Coca-Cola. Those small moments of humanity, simple as they were, stood as proof that values could outlast violence. The same men who had once cheered for war now cherished peace. They had learned that strength was not only in weapons, but in compassion. Years later, one former prisoner wrote in his memoir, "In America, I learned what freedom truly means. It was not shouted through loudspeakers. It was lived in the quiet decency of everyday life." Back in Germany, some former POWs gathered to form friendship associations, connections between ex-soldiers and their American guards. Letters and gifts were exchanged for decades. Photographs showed old men smiling together, once enemies, now friends. The story of ice cream and Coca-Cola may sound trivial to those who never lived through war. But for the men who did, those simple tastes became symbols of a better world and a different kind of victory. Because in the end, America's greatest weapon wasn't just its tanks or planes, it was its ideals, the belief that even a defeated enemy still deserved dignity. When the last German POW ships sailed home, many of them stood on deck looking back toward the fading outline of America. They had come as prisoners. They left as witnesses of something greater than war. Years later, when they told their children about the camps, they didn't speak of barbed wire or guards. They spoke of kindness, of ice cream on a hot day, of Coca-Cola shared between enemies, and of a country that showed them humanity when the world had forgotten it.